Great. Well, good morning to everyone, and thank you for joining us in person, for those in the room here, and online, where I know we have guests from around the world. I'm Jenny Town. I am the director of the 38 North program here at Stimson Center, and a senior fellow. And we're pleased today to be organizing today's event with Lumen, the Database Center for North Korean Human Rights, NKDB, and the Unification Media Group, UMG, all prominent institutions working on North Korean human rights and information access issues. So really, since the pandemic-related closure of borders in 2020, North Koreans at home and abroad have experienced an unprecedented level of isolation, control, and surveillance beyond what normally existed. Things like fortifying borders, stricter controls of movement within and outside of the country, emphasizing purity and adherence to ideology, and imposing harsher punishments for ideological violations and more. So this is all happening while also integrating technologies that seem to provide the people greater personal services and communication options and greater opportunities to work overseas. So today's discussion is really meant to explore and discuss how these realities can coexist in practice, exploring how internal control and external repression reinforce one another, and what this means for accountability, protection, and policy responses moving forward. And so we have an expert panel here to join us, a couple from Korea directly that just got in yesterday, so hopefully they're still awake and alert. On my left here is Martin Williams. He's my colleague here at Stimson's 38 North program, a senior fellow. He's also the head of the board for Lumen. His primary interests are in North Korea's technology, infrastructure, broadcasting system, and propaganda. He launched the North Korea Tech website in 2010 and our North Korea Tech Lab initiative last year as well. He follows closely North Korea's technology development, especially related to telecommunications and surveillance. Hannah Song, to his left, Executive Director for the Database Center for North Korean Human Rights. And she has been the Executive Director since, she's been with the organization since 2015 and is known as one of the most respected voices on North Korean human rights. She holds a bachelor's degree from the University College Utrecht in the Netherlands and a master's degree in international human rights law from the University of Oxford. And on the far left is Rose Adams. She's a communications manager at Unification Media Group, UMG, where she specializes in North Korean media, marketization, and women's rights. UMG reports closely on North Korean issues and operates a network of citizen reporters inside the country, is also coupled with Daily NK, which many of you might be familiar with already. So we have a great panel to walk us through this discussion. Each are going to present for about 10 minutes up front. We'll have a little discussion amongst the panelists, and then we'll move to questions both from the audience and online. For those who are in the room, when we get to the Q&A, please do wait to be called on and wait for the microphone so that our online audience can also hear you. And those who are online, please feel free to pose questions at any time in the Q&A box, and we will be integrating them in the latter half of the session. And so with that, I will turn to my colleague, Martin, to start us off.
Thank you very much, Jenny. Good morning. A couple of years ago, I did some investigation into changes in the digital surveillance, changes in the surveillance system in North Korea. And a lot of that was based around the introduction of digital technology. North Korea had in the past, and still to this day, practices a very analog form of surveillance through things like the Imminban system, through things like random checks of people on the street. But with the introduction of technology, and particularly of smartphones, that was beginning to be not necessarily changed, but supplemented. And that's what I wanted to sort of update on today and talk a little bit about.
We have slides.
Oh, okay, there we go. One of the things we're publishing today, in fact, we published it earlier this morning, is a new report on the smartphone sector in North Korea. It's called Smartphones of North Korea, and it looks at what's going on, and this sort of gives you an idea of why digital surveillance, I think, is going to become more and more pervasive and more dangerous for North Koreans in the future. Compared to just a few years ago, there are now more than 24 different brands of cell phone available in North Korea. This is quite an incredible number for a country of just 26 million people. If you go to the mobile phone store here or in South Korea or somewhere, you'll find Apple, Samsung, and maybe like 2, 3, 4 other companies, and that's about it. North Korea at the moment, there's a massive amount of competition amongst trading companies to sell people phones. And I think this is reflective of not just the state's acceptance and approval of mobile telecoms, but also amongst the consumers in North Korea, their enthusiasm to kind of adopt these. The phones that are being sold in North Korea are relatively nice. This is just one of the brands. Most of the phones are smartphones, but they are still selling some regular old feature phones, which is interesting from a surveillance point of view, because it's much more difficult to do surveillance on the feature phones. But also, yeah, this is just to sort of say that the phones being sold are all quite modern, up-to-date Android phones that are capable of doing a lot of different types of surveillance on users, in addition to all of the other things that smartphones do. Now, going hand in hand with all of these new phones is the spread of North Korea's cellular network. This is a map that we produced earlier this year. This is based on satellite imagery analysis, where we've tried to locate the cell phone towers. And what you can see, I think, is that pretty much most of the populated areas in North Korea are now covered with a cellular signal. So again, if you're doing surveillance on mobile phones, you can now track and you can now continue to be in connection with people in most of the populated areas across the country. This is based on satellite imagery. There's definitely cellular base towers that we've missed because they're difficult to see. So the reality is probably even more than this, but this is what we've been able to confirm. So the network itself is growing. So as more people get cell phones, as the network grows, what we're seeing is, first of all, the movement of state services online. This is an app that allows people to order medicines and order drugs and things and have them delivered to their home. It supposedly works nationwide. We're not sure of the reality of this, but no matter how it works now, this will probably expand across the country and become more reliable. This is an example of, I think, one of the things the state is doing to try to move a lot of its services and try to move a lot of things online. The reason being not just that it's more convenient for people, but also it becomes more difficult for theft to occur. It becomes more difficult for corruption in the supply chains for all of these things. But for the North Korean citizens, it removes or tries to remove a lot of those kind of gray areas where at the moment they're able to operate. It removes their ability to pay off market for certain things if everything is controlled in a digital supply chain. We're seeing it with drugs. Grain coupons have also started going online. And a couple of years ago, North Korea did pass a new law that instructed all of the ministries to put services online. So that whole sector of North Korean society is starting to move online, and with it, a lot of the kind of wiggle room that existed in society will be being taken away. One of the other things that we've seen on the mobile phones is a lot of entertainment. On the one hand, that's great for people. They've got a lot more things to do. There's multiple video streaming services. You can watch television live on your phones. But this is also part of the state's attempts to stop people consuming foreign content, smuggled in content. One of the, I think, biggest reasons that people were consuming foreign content was that there was a lack of other content to consume. Some of the North Koreans will undoubtedly continue to consume foreign content, but I think it was unrealistic for the government to clamp down on this stuff coming in if they didn't give people an alternative. And what we're seeing now through digital technology, mostly phones, but also smart TVs that are sold in the country, is that the state is doubling down on its efforts to provide approved content to people. So this will, I think, further restrict people's access to illicit content that comes in from South Korea and other countries. Mobile phones are being used for e-payments a lot. There are at least 5 different e-payment systems being used in North Korea at the moment. This is, again, something that can be used to clamp down on the illicit economy, because now all of the payments, all of the purchases, everything is tracked. If it's tracked digitally, tax has to be paid on it. The folks at Daily NK have done reporting about how in the North Korean street markets even, people are being pressured to start accepting digital payments. So the state is using technology again to start exerting surveillance and control over these informal areas of North Korea. It tried to do it with laws and things, now it's doing it with digital technology. One of the things that will probably happen in North Korea, because it's happened everywhere else in the world, is that despite the additional ability of surveillance, people will happily adopt these technologies because they bring convenience and they make life easier. So I think the state will ultimately be successful in this push. And then there are, this is just one of the e-wallet apps. Again, it allows the e-payments, but also things like the grain coupons are on here. You can buy train tickets, you can buy bus tickets, everything in the digital world, so everything is being capable of being tracked. I don't believe that at the moment all of this is tracked. I don't believe the North Korean government is pulling information from everyone's phones and putting it in a big database. For a start, there is not a large data center in North Korea that can do this. But certainly, if you're on a list of people they want to watch, then it becomes much more possible for them to target individual people and to start taking this information from the phones. The other thing that we've seen since COVID, actually, in the last few years, has been the adoption of something called the mobile user ID. In some of the North Korean phones that we got prior to the sort of COVID pandemic. And the pandemic is really when things shifted. Before the pandemic, there were less brands, the apps on the phones were less kind of feature-rich. But that time when North Korea was closed, everything sort of seemed to supercharge, and now there's a lot more going on in the mobile space. All of these new brands have appeared, as I mentioned, a lot more new apps. And a lot of apps now, when you sign into them, they ask you to put in your mobile user ID, which includes things like your national ID or local ID number and things like that. So people's identities on these digital platforms are starting to be tied to real-world identities as well, which helps tracking as well. So that's kind of what's going on now in the digital space. It's all happening around cell phones. The report has just gone up, so I'm going to plug it. You can download it from nktechlab.org and from 38 North later today. And then also for other technology stuff, NK Tech Lab is on Substack as well. But I'm going to pass this over to Hannah.
Well, thanks, Martin. I think it shows a really stark picture on how, with the convenience of cell phones and the communication abilities of cell phones, it also increases the data collection and tracking capabilities, the digital surveillance capabilities, and does start to address some of the core issues that Kim Jong-un has complained about in recent years of bribery and corruption. And the ability to circumvent the system. And so what once was seen as a potential, here's a way for us to maybe have better communication, for the people to have better communication for more hopeful purposes. It seems that, as the technology advances, so does the actual control capabilities as well.
Yeah, absolutely.
Hannah, let's move to you.
Thanks, Jenny, and thank you again to the Stimson Center for having us. I'm Hannah Song. I'm from the Database Center for North Korean Human Rights. We go by NKDB for short because it's a bit of a mouthful to remember the entire name. We're usually based in Seoul, South Korea, and I think we really wanted to use this opportunity to share the reality of what it's like to be working on this issue, especially during a time where we often think that North Korea is not changing, and I think Martin's presentation really has showed how North Korea is adapting, but how does that affect the work that CSOs, human rights organizations, are working on this issue? And I think a lot of it is in response to how the DPRK government has changed its stance, especially after the COVID-19 pandemic. For those of you who are not aware of NKDB, we were established in 2003, which was really during the peak of when there was that wave of North Korean escapees leaving North Korea and then eventually coming to South Korea. When we first started our work, we really started as a documentation organization, thinking that through documentation and managing these records in a database, soon that there would be transitional justice. This was during a time post the fall of the Berlin Wall, it was clear without the support of the Soviet Union, many, and maybe some people in this room were also predicting that North Korea would not last as long as it did. How wrong we were 20 or 30 years later. And since then, our work has evolved to just go beyond documenting for future purposes, but how can this documentation be used now to provide justice and what we call through micro-transitional justice procedures. What this really led to, not just by NKDB, but through a community of North Korean human rights activists, was in 2014, the peak of, I think, when there was international attention and scrutiny on the issue was after the publication of the UN Commission of Inquiry report with the conclusion that there were crimes against humanity happening in North Korea, that the top officials, namely Kim Jong-un, head of state, should be referred to the ICC. And I really think that was when there was the most hope for what may be for accountability and for justice for the victims of human rights violations. But again, a lot of that has changed, and I think it's important to reflect on the past 10 years since this report has come out. The report was made possible by, as I mentioned, by organizations such as NKDB being able to document cases of human rights violations through speaking with the victims directly. From 1950 until 1998, we had less than 1,000 North Korean escapees coming to South Korea over a period of 40 or so years. But after then, we had 1,000, 2,000, almost 3,000 people coming every year. And then we can see that this really changes after Kim Jong-un comes into power, and then after COVID-19, I think that has drastically shifted, and that has also led to a huge difference in the way that organizations have been able to do their work. 2019, I'd say, is the last normal year that North Korean human rights organizations were able to access information. We had about 1,047 North Korean escapees coming to South Korea in 2019. 2020, 229. 2021, 63. 2022, 67. 2023, 196, 2024, 236, and even 2025 last year, less than 230 people coming. This is 10% of the numbers that we used to be seeing. And the people who are coming into South Korea are not coming from North Korea directly. We have had a few, less than 50 in the past 5 years. The majority of the people that have come to South Korea in recent years are the ones who have already been overseas. The ones in Russia who were dispatched as overseas workers, or women who had been trafficked into China who have been in hiding for the past 10, 15, 20 years. So, how does that affect the work that organizations have been able to do for the past 20 years? if the North Korean escapees that we used to be able to meet directly, and this is really important for documentation organizations. It's not, there's one way of being able to monitor the situation, such as the way that Martin has been able to see that there are changes on the ground. But for legal accountability, for judicial procedures, you need to be able to conduct 2-hour, 3-hour in-depth interviews to make sure that the information being collected reaches these legal standards. But how are you able to do that if you're not able to speak with these people in person and in a safe manner? I know 38 North has done really some great research on this as well, but this is a satellite image that was taken from an article that Reuters published a few years ago, which really shows, again, the reason why there are so few North Korean escapees entering South Korea. Quite frankly, COVID-19, I think, was the best thing that could have happened to Kim Jong-un, and we can really see that they used this public health crisis as an excuse to shut down its borders. Over the COVID-19 pandemic, almost 500 kilometers of new border fencing and fortification happened, and this was the most prominent route for North Koreans to be able to leave the DPRK. The 50 or so North Koreans that I mentioned that have come to South Korea in recent years have all come not via China and Southeast Asia, which is their usual route. They've all come directly from North Korea via land, via sea, which are much, much more dangerous than in the past. And to add to this, I think the image of these three leaders in September 2025 really speaks volumes of where we're at. Not only was COVID the best thing that happened to Kim Jong-un and being able to stop information not just from coming in, but leaving the country, he's been able to really deepen this alliance with two other leaders who, as I mentioned, in 2014, with the peak international scrutiny and attention on the issue through the call to send Kim Jong-un to the ICC, this really sent a lot of messages to North Korea about how the international community does not take impunity lightly. That if you do commit these crimes, there are repercussions. But Putin has a warrant from the ICC. Xi Jinping, it's known that there are major human rights violations happening in China, yet they were able to stand in front of the world and send a really strong message about how through this alliance they will be able to continue different types of repression. And so this is some of the work that NKDB has been focusing on, and I think you've been, for those of you who are in person, you've been able to receive some executive summaries, but these reports are also available on our website for those of you who are online. But the shift in this alliance, which is obviously it's not a new alliance between DPRK and Russia, but it has really deepened after the Ukraine conflict. For years, North Korea has been sending overseas workers to Russia as a way to earn foreign currency. But with the lack of manpower that Russians are also facing, with many of them men entering the conflict, North Koreans have been able to fill that gap despite the fact that there are Security Council resolutions. And they've been able to use, really gray areas in which they've been able to evade these sanctions by using student visas rather than working visas. And we can see that this is not just the Russian government allowing this to happen, but there are now other partners that have allowed for this exploitation of labor to continue. Now there are migration agencies in Russia that are very active in supporting these visa applications. Universities in Russia are also joining up with universities in North Korea to be able to provide positions for North Korean students who are actually there to earn foreign currency for the DPRK government. And of course, with the confirmation of North Korean soldiers fighting the war in Ukraine, we can see that the form of transnational repression and exploitation that was just in the form of laborers in the past has now expanded to military efforts as well. And increasingly, we're also looking at what is happening with the North Koreans who are in China. These are two reports that NKDB recently published. And when we see a country becoming more closed, we assume that means it's going to be less globally active. But in the DPR case, I think what we observe is the opposite. Internally, we've seen deeper isolation, but greater surveillance. But externally, this long arm of transnational repression. We spoke about the border closure in terms of a physical wall earlier, but what many North Koreans in China are facing is this digital wall in which this growing digital surveillance of North Koreans has become more of an issue. As I mentioned, the North Koreans that are entering South Korea at the moment are ones who have been living in North Korea for 10, 15, 20 years. When we were interviewing these women, we asked them, why now? It's not that South Korea has necessarily changed in that the support that they would receive in South Korea has necessarily gotten different, but it was actually the push factor in China that led to this greater form of escape. Many of these women spoke Chinese fluently, were quite well settled, but recently what we're starting to see is that many of these North Korean women are being forced to install tracking apps, location tracking and surveillance apps that allow them to be able to stay in China. This is also under the condition that they have a child in China, that they are married to a Chinese man, and that they are in a harmonious relationship with their in-laws. But in that case, then they have to download an app, which means that they have to send photographs of themselves every day. They'll take blood samples as well, so that this means that with China's growing digital surveillance of all migrants and even their own people, in the past, the way that they were able to come through Southeast Asia to South Korea eventually was through what is known as the Underground Railroad. But this has become impossible with the growth of different types of surveillance. And as Martin mentioned, in what we're facing in North Korea is that because of this convenience factor, even if North Koreans know that this is a form of surveillance, for them it's better than being sent back to the DPRK. And this is very much in connection with the growing forced repatriation that we're seeing in North Korea, and with China and the DPRK's growing ties. Even with China's reorganization of its military structure in 2018, they managed to make sure that the different provinces in China and North Korea maintain different types of relationships so that they could be seamless repatriation routes if North Koreans are caught. We'll be publishing a lot of this information about exact routes, entities and institutions that are responsible for these repatriations on our website, on our Visual Atlas website at the end of the month, where you can see exact institutions that are available. And this is for us going beyond not just North Korea's responsibility of these human rights violations, but clearly all of this has been possible because of China and Russia's ties as well. And just lastly, I would also say that it's also important to mention that the transnational repression that we're seeing doesn't end once they come safely to South Korea. With North Korea's growing cyber capabilities. In the past, if there were phishing attempts, I think it was very, very obvious that it came from a North Korean hacker. But with the growth of AI, I would say that the emails that they're sending, the ways that they are targeting human rights activists, North Korean escapees, has grown. But are we as a community prepared to respond to this transnational repression? I think is an important question for us to consider. Just lastly, this is a poem that some North Korean escapees provided us with, which reminds us that I think it's very easy to forget about North Korea because there are no North Korean escapees coming out, because we're not getting this live stream of information that we're seeing, that we do see in other atrocities across the world. But that doesn't mean that what's that this isn't happening in North Korea. And in fact, it's scarier to think about what we don't know because we're not able to hear these stories directly. But I'll end here because I know we've gone over a bit of time, but thank you for that.
Thank you, Hannah. That was fascinating. And it just goes to show that while internally there's greater surveillance capabilities of North Korean everyday life and activities, that fewer are getting out. That means we're getting less information in the outside world about what's happening and being able to have these in-depth conversations about the conditions on the ground. But certainly there's collusion that goes on in order to maintain that kind of surveillance and repression even overseas from some of North Korea's key partners, such as China and Russia. It's funny that you mentioned the phishing and targeting, because that is something that here in DC in the policy community we're very familiar with and have also are learning to cope with North Korea's increasingly sophisticated capabilities. It's so difficult to tell what's real and not real anymore. So if anyone's watching and we haven't answered your emails, sometimes it does look fake. Let's move next to Rose.
Thank you again to the Stimson Center for providing this opportunity. I think among all of us, UMG might be one of the lesser known organizations. We don't come overseas a lot, so it's great to have this opportunity. It seemed like in the room, people were much more familiar with our partner, Daily NK. So to give a little bit of an explanation of how these two are related, we are sister organizations, but we complete one full kind of cycle of the information cycle. So Hannah talked a lot about escapees being one of the major sources of information about what's happening recently in North Korea. And one of the other major sources, I'm proud to say perhaps, is Daily NK. So we have a mixed team of South Korean and North Korean journalists who work together with citizen journalists and sources inside of North Korea, China, Russia, and other countries to bring information about what's happening inside of North Korea, out of the country, to the international community to help supplement these accountability efforts to, for example, with the smartphones, to help see how people are using them and understanding them in real time. UMG is the other side of that information coin, so to speak. We take the information from the international community and we bring it back into North Korea. So we've been running radio broadcasts into North Korea for the last 20 years, specifically with content in a North Korean style, at North Koreans' level of comprehension and background information. Naturally, both of these activities, getting information into North Korea and getting information out of North Korea, have gotten a lot more difficult for the reasons that my co-panelists have explained very eloquently. But if I could give a recap of what's really changed, I think we can all agree that the COVID-19 pandemic was really a catalyst for shutting down North Korea and kind of recentering the state's control over every aspect of life. And if I was to point to the major changes that affect specifically the flow of information, the first I would say is the border closure and the near eradication, not only slowdown in state trade, but the near eradication of private smuggling. Because it's so much harder to cross the border, you see a lot fewer people engaging in private smuggling. They have to go through, for example, corporate smuggling routes. So there's a lot fewer person-to-person exchanges because the flow of goods is the flow of information. Second is the crackdown on Chinese-made cell phones. For those who are perhaps not familiar, North Korean smartphones naturally cannot make international calls. So if escapees try to talk to their family in South Korea or elsewhere, or when we try to communicate with our journalists, often it's a North Korean smartphone being held up to a Chinese-made cell phone that's connected to a Chinese network that helps us connect to people. And so these Chinese cell phones are a key link in connecting people inside of North Korea to the international community. And North Korea is very much aware of the danger that this poses to their informational control. And so we've seen, especially post-COVID, extreme crackdowns on Chinese cell phones, which not only, again, impacts people's ability to do trade, both privately and even public officials have been told to limit their use of Chinese cell phones, which makes it harder to communicate even for state purposes with their Chinese partners. The third point is the legal codification of making access to outside information a crime. So in 2020, right in time for the COVID-19 pandemic, North Korea passed a law called the Anti-Reactionary Thought Law, which made the possession, consumption, and distribution of outside information illegal, punishable by several years of forced labor, and up to and including the death sentence. On top of that, soon after, we had the Youth Education Guarantee Act, which again specifically targeted young people, so students, who are engaging in outside media, and putting the responsibility on their parents, so guilt by association for young people engaging in this conduct. And lastly, the Pyongyang Cultural Language Protection Act, which forbids even the use of non-North Korean or South Korean mannerisms and styles of speech. So for example, on some of the phones that Martin's been looking at, there's an autocorrect feature where, for example, if you type in oppa, which means literally older brother, but you'll hear it very often in K-dramas to refer to one's boyfriend or husband. In the North, it only refers to your biological brother. But if I was to type in oppa into one of these cell phones, some of them block the word outright. And other versions will change it to tongji, which is comrade who is older than me. And one that I have seen issues a small warning that says this word is only to be used for biological relatives. So even if you are communicating with people you are allowed to, you cannot even freely choose your words. And then on top of that, we talked about the digital and the analog reinforcing each other. So street inspections as well will look through the phones and search for styles of speech or references to South Korean pop culture. So legally, all of this, and then as Martin, I think, very nicely laid out, the laws are in place and they're now being enforced in the digital space. And the creation of this very much self-contained digital environment where the only devices you are allowed to use are the North Korean devices that come pre-installed with tracking and surveillance software, and that you cannot download foreign apps, you cannot open foreign files, to keep it as controlled and in the state's purview as possible. So to put what this means kind of in real terms for our activities at UMG and Daily NK, as well as for ordinary people inside of North Korea, I would first draw attention to UMG. Every 2 years, we conduct a media environment survey. So for example, in 2024, we surveyed 100 North Koreans who are current residents of North Korea all throughout the country about what devices they use, what kind of foreign content they watch, why they watch it. And we've done these surveys every 2 years or so. And we happened to do one in 2019, right before the COVID pandemic. And what we've seen before and after the COVID pandemic is a steep decline in the number of people who reported that, yes, I watch K-dramas or I watch foreign content at least once a month. Before that, it was close to 3/4, so 75% or so of people who engaged with foreign content did so at least monthly. Now it's closer to 1/4. So we do see that there is a significant deterrent effect because of the anti-reactionary thought laws and because of enforcement. Likewise, Daily NK tracks political prison camp number populations and what charges people are being brought in. Between 2020 and 2022 or so, the vast majority of new people being brought into political prison camps were being brought in on charges of violating pandemic prevention procedures. Since 2023, however, the vast majority have been brought in on anti-reactionary thought law charges. So you can see the scale at which this is being enforced. And lastly, when we talk about, for example, the threat of being found out or even kind of closing the digital avenues to access outside information, when we talk to people about what devices they use to watch, I think it might surprise you, but over 50% of people say they watch it on LCD or LED TVs. These come in cheaply from China, and so they're Chinese made, not North Korean, and don't have the surveillance software built in. And more recently, we've seen people are using Notels, which are these little small kind of laptop size playing devices, which unlike LED and LCD TVs, use much less electricity. So we see that computers and cell phones are very rarely used to engage with foreign content precisely because of fears about the tracking and surveillance built into the products. People are not necessarily aware of how much is there, and so many of them opt to simply not use it at all for fear of being caught. However, if I do say that there's one thing that gives me hope, is that among the people we've been tracking and speaking to, the number of people who are engaging with foreign content is starting to slowly rebound. And part of this we would attribute is to simply, it is impossible to enforce such a high level of crackdowns for so long. Particularly, it's an open secret in North Korea that the #1 consumers of foreign content are the enforcers. So it's the people in the Boivu, the Ministry of State Security, who are watching all of the latest K-dramas because they can do so with more or less impunity. Similarly, in the case of Chinese cell phones, the Ministry of State Security and local security officials generally know who likely has them, whether they're remittance brokers, human brokers, smugglers, traders. And so they have these agreements where you pay them off, or when things are tough and they're being told from their superiors, hey, you need to pay up, they go to these people and say, hey, I've been protecting you, pay me or I'll arrest you. And so it's against their own interest to a degree to arrest everyone who has a Chinese cell phone, right? In North Korea, there's a phrase, mogul-ar, like you have eggs to eat, that you're in a position of power, there's money that comes from that. However, if you arrest everyone, there is no more source of income. And so there is a perverse disincentive to fully enforce the system. So this gives me hope. I find hope in corruption. But lastly,
only in North Korea.
only in North Korea. But of course, the analog system has these sorts of human flaws, and so the digital system is being used to reinforce and to prevent corruption. And so things like, for example, electronic signal detection teams go around particularly around border areas to pick up people who are connecting to Chinese cell networks. And so these systems have gotten a lot more sophisticated since North Korea's partnership with Russia in the Ukraine-Russia war and their experience with drones and electromagnetic magnetic warfare. So it's definitely a cat and mouse game as people develop strategies and the state develops new strategies of its own. So again, I like to end things on a hopeful note. So beside corruption, what else do we have? Radio, fortunately, still works. That's kind of why UMG has continued to use radio for the last 20 years. Radio still works virtually all across the entire country. And unfortunately, because of current circumstances outside of North Korea, the South Korean government and US government have both cut a lot of funding for or support for radios that specifically broadcast to North Korea. I'm happy to see that RFA is coming back and bringing back their Korean service. But I believe it was Martin who did the math on this once, that as of July of last year, about 80% of the hours that were being broadcast into North Korea were cut. So we're operating with a lot fewer hours, but it does still reach people. Especially we've heard stories from Daily NK about young people assembling radios on their own to listen and tune in with their friends or tune in secret. So the analog is making a comeback, perhaps in some ways. Secondly, according to our surveys, domestic demand, regardless of enforcement, remains unabated. And as I said, it's inherently unsustainable to keep up high levels of enforcement. And particularly, I think the Russia-Ukraine war has piqued people's curiosity again. One of the reasons, for example, that North Korea officially acknowledged its participation in the war after so many months of denial was because the rumors had already spread throughout the entire country in North Korea. And so at that point, it was harder to keep the lid on the genie, so to speak. And it was better to publicly announce. So these things do have power inside the country. And the last thing that gives me hope is recently we saw that North Korea and China have reopened their passenger train service. And so that means where there's people flow, there's information flow. If they can't do it through technology, Chinese traders will talk with their North Korean counterparts, and it's impossible to only talk business. So the information does flow through these other person-to-person exchanges. Or in the case of, for example, people going overseas as overseas laborers, they do encounter the outside world and bring that information back. So as North Korea goes out into the world, that does expose it as well to outside information.
Great, well, thanks, Rose. It's always good to be a little bit hopeful, especially in a situation that seems like, anytime we make any progress, something will happen. So it's like 2 steps forward, 1 step back, sometimes 2 steps forward, 3 steps back, and we start over again. But I think we've heard from each of the panelists now, again, not only the internal capabilities for tracking, that harder to get information out, harder to get information in. Mm-hmm. And we really appreciate the work that UMG and Daily NK does in order to try and do a lot of this kind of information flow as much as we can. as difficult as that is, especially for the people on the ground, and the risks, the increasing
Yes.
risk that they take in order to try and provide that information to us, since people aren't getting out. I think if we pick up a couple of points that each of you have mentioned, maybe starting with this idea of in the content that you've seen in the entertainment you talked about, there's greater and greater entertainment options for North Koreans inside the country in order to try and offset some of what they're missing from the outside information. And so they're getting less stuff in. There's harsher punishments for actually viewing it. But some of the content that they're providing also includes some foreign content, right? And so maybe you could talk a little bit more about what you've seen so far in terms of that foreign content, and why you think those specific nuggets are being allowed.
So a couple of different places that I've been looking at some of the content that has been available inside the country. One of the things that everybody watches is North Korean, well, not everybody, I'm sure there's not many people in this room that watch North Korean state TV. But some of the people watch North Korean state TV. It's full of propaganda. It is non-stop propaganda. Even the dramas have underlying propaganda messages. And that's, I think, for many people, the very visible side of North Korean media. But there are various sources that we don't usually see. One of them is a company called Mokram Video that produces, back in the day, CDs and then DVDs. And now they have one of the video streaming apps is from that company. We were able to look at the library of content available in the app. Something like 20,000 different videos are available in the app. And they run a whole sort of cross-section of different areas. A lot of it is foreign movies, but then when you start looking into the foreign movies and you look at the country where the movies are from, you see a lot of movies from China. There are a lot of movies from former Soviet states. At first, I thought there were a lot of Russian movies, but it turns out that most of them are actually Soviet movies, which kind of shows you how old they are. But then beyond that, there's also a lot of instructional content. There's a lot of language learning content in there, English, Chinese particularly. A few other languages as well are in there. There are some nature documentaries. There are a few animated movies as well. And the other place I got a chance to see recently was that North Korea has 4 television channels. Only one of them is on satellite that we can see outside of North Korea. But I spent a couple of days right up at the border watching North Korean TV from inside the country. And they have a channel called Mansudae TV that's on air at the weekends, and that carries a lot of foreign content as well. Saturday night they carried a Russian movie that was not Soviet, it was actually more modern. There was an Indian drama on Sunday lunchtime. And then in the afternoon on Sunday, there was Ratatouille, the Disney Pixar movie. And we see this in Mokram Video as well. They don't have much American content, but the American content they have is all Disney Pixar entertainment. So I think there is foreign content getting in, but everything, of course, has to be approved. Everything has to be watched and potentially edited before it is distributed. The foreign content that is being distributed around the country is stuff that is very safe. So a Disney movie, a nature documentary, maybe a music performance from an orchestra or something like that. Nothing that could be potentially subversive gets into the country through official means. But it does mean that when North Koreans sit down in the evening, maybe in Pyongyang, and they switch on their television, especially if they have there's an IPTV service there now as well. It is possible to spend an entire evening watching non-propaganda content, but all of that content has still been approved, has still been sanctioned by the state. It's very different from the stuff that used to flow in a lot more easily, and now it's a lot more difficult to come in. which was particularly all of the South Korean content. There is no South Korean content on any of the official platforms, and I can't imagine there ever will be. So that's I think the biggest thing that has been lost in all of this, and this state system that is bringing foreign content and will never be able to match what was coming in illicitly, because the South Korean content it's their neighboring country, it's the same people, it's the same language. The foreign content can't replace any of that. The official foreign content can't replace any of that.
If I can add on one thing about kind of the North Korea state trying to fill in this gap so that people aren't tempted to engage with foreign content. They've also been changing the movie style from recent productions. Kim Jong-un is not the same aficionado that his father was. The number of movies that have come out recently is significantly smaller. But one that came out very recently called Days and Nights of Confrontation, for all of you who might be watching it, is considered relatively racy by North Korean standards. There's a scene with partial nudity, which I've never heard of in any North Korea propaganda production. The main character is a villain. He's trying to assassinate the Kim leader. It has very gory scenes of fighting on top of a train where the bad guy falls under the train tracks. So it's very flashy production. It's supposed to be, I think, a lot kind of like the old guy, very much South Korean action style is what I got from it. And so it seems like North Korea is trying to catch up and put that same glamour onto propaganda content.
It's an interesting plot line. It's like North Korea created their own interview, their own version. This is what they learned from the Sony hack. I think that's a really interesting note. Let's go back to this notion of radio, of like how are North Koreans consuming information, getting information from outside. And of course, Daly, you noted that UMG continues to do radio, but with the loss of all of the radio stations that actually took place, are you hearing from people on the ground that they've actually noticed that there's less information that they can access? How are they accessing your broadcasting? And how has the fewer radio broadcasts been impacted by North Korean jamming capabilities because there's less to deal with?
Yeah, no, absolutely. That is a huge problem that we have been trying to keep on top of. Certainly, we ran an article, I want to say 2 months ago or so, where we'd interviewed people shortly after RFA went off the air. And while the number of radio listeners is a lot smaller than people who access foreign content, there is still about, I'd say, 17%, I think, according to our last report, who do regularly listen to foreign radio stations. And it can be hard to tune into these stations, so people tend to choose one that they like and really cling on to it. And so there were very dedicated RFA listeners. And so we were able to find people talking about, the silence when I tuned in was very disheartening. And so there are people who have been directly feeling that impact. And certainly just the number of hours getting into the country. For example, at UMG, we usually transmit from 10 p.m. to 1 a.m. That's North Korean prime time for listening in the dead of night. But a lot of these other services were going 24 hours a day, which just makes it easier to find your way when you're dialing around to try to find it. And certainly, as far as the impact jamming-wise, in the past with these 24-hour stations that were broadcasting on multiple frequencies, especially because they were broadcasting from radio stations in South Korea, it was impossible for North Korea to overpower them with their jamming. But now there's so many fewer stations, and they're broadcasting from much more distant locations like Taiwan, for example, that by the time that signal reaches North Korea, it's much easier to jam. And so fortunately at UMG, we do have partners who help us monitor the quality of reception inside of North Korea. And we haven't experienced any jamming issues yet, but that is something that we do constantly monitor for and have to change frequencies, which of course means that people have to find us again. And so it is this constant kind of chase.
I think the other important thing to remember with radio as well is that radio is the only way to reach North Koreans immediately. Mm-hmm. It's a live broadcast medium, unlike the USBs and things that could, I don't know how long it took a drama to get into North Korea, but it was probably weeks, if not months, after its air in South Korea to get into North Korea. On radio, you can put that stuff in immediately. We've just seen this a couple of weeks ago in Iran. The very weekend that bombing began, the VOA scrambled to get its Persian language TV service up on satellite so it could directly talk to the Iranian people. With the dearth of radio at the moment, it becomes more easy to block, it becomes more difficult to listen to, and that means that if there's any sort of issue on the peninsula, be it something external to North Korea or be it internal, it's now much more difficult for the wider world to speak directly to the North Korean people. So that's one of the most important capabilities that has been lost with all of the radio going off the air.
So we've talked a little bit about how the Chinese cell phones and cellular networks are really important in the cell phone components of being able to get more instant information in and out. And if there's fewer Chinese cell phones going in, obviously that really hampers the ability to facilitate that communication. What about some of the new technologies that are available, like satellite-to-cell services that exist? Are the North Korean cell phones equipped to prevent that? And how might newer technologies be able to enable some greater communication capabilities? Martin, we'll start with you.
So I've been looking, the satellite to cell stuff has been very interesting. Most people will be familiar with Starlink. And when Starlink first came out, a lot of people looked at it for North Korea. But the problem with Starlink is you still need this dish that goes somewhere on the roof. Just coming onto the market now are this new generation of services that put a 4G or 5G signal from a satellite direct to a cell phone. So just a regular cell phone like you have in your pocket will work straight off a satellite. That, I think, is much more interesting in terms of getting information into and out of North Korea. There are problems, though. North Korean domestic phones will definitely not work with it because they are set to work with nothing but the official North Korean cellular signals. So if you were to do that, you'd have to still smuggle phones in, but that is possible. One of the advantages to these services is that they would cover the entire peninsula. So if the North Koreans were to try to detect people using them, they now have to do that nationwide rather than just at the border. The other issue, though, affecting it is sort of one of our own, which is that the companies providing these services are US companies. There are sanctions on North Korea. There is international telecommunications law. There's a whole lot of reasons why, even though the actual technology works and the technology is perfect for doing this, I think initially it's not going to work. It's nothing that can't be worked through. And personally, I've been looking at the technology that's used with North Korea for the last at least 20 years. The direct-to-cell phone services are personally the most exciting thing I've seen in 20 years in terms of starting to break this information blockade that's there. But there are issues that need to be figured out first.
And Hannah, to bring you back into the conversation, there are obviously, with the partnerships with China, Russia, and other kind of Russian-linked countries in these networks, there's more and more North Koreans getting out of the country. They're not coming to South Korea, they're not defecting, when they're in those spaces. But are there opportunities to reach them if it's students and workers? What are the conditions like, and what have efforts been so far in these spaces?
Right, I think it was around 2015, 2016 when research about the human rights conditions of overseas workers really started to grow, and there was a lot of advocacy around that. And the major push at the time was, how do we prevent these overseas workers from going to countries to generate a profit for the DPRK? I think the focus for a very long time was just on that cash flow. But for us, and I think for others who work in the information space, it was also an opportunity. And to think about these North Koreans on an individual level, and I think that's really important for human rights organizations to think about, and which is often overlooked, where this is the only opportunity for them to see for themselves beyond the, yes, even if they're in North Korea watching foreign movies or documentaries or whatnot that is being either smuggled in or being shown officially, for them to experience, I think, even little things about discrepancies within the workplace. Then, even if they're put in units by themselves, there are going to be other migrant workers that are working on the same construction site, where they're going to see, oh, they're getting paid directly. Whereas when we get paid, it goes to our management, it goes to the security officials who are surveilling us 24/7, or little things like access to phones that people are able, when they have a break, being able to, go on YouTube or whatnot. And that, I think, really sends a really strong message to these overseas workers. And beyond, there was a lot of research at the beginning. They were only focusing on those working in the construction or logging space. But as we mentioned earlier, we're seeing a growth of North Koreans sending IT workers overseas. And they will have access to the internet. Yes, there will be surveillance of what they're accessing, but we've heard from many of the IT workers who have defected that the first thing that they will search for is Kim Jong-un, Kim Jong-il. And so when we're putting information about the Kim leadership or the Kim family online, what is information that will help them to make these decisions for themselves, whether that is to defect or whether that's to take that information back home. And I think eventually, for many of us in the human rights space, we don't want to see waves of defection. That's not what we want. We ultimately want there to be some form of change within North Korea, where the North Korean people are able to make these decisions for themselves. And I think, utilizing these overseas workers, whether they're the ones in Russia, China, or there are some in the Middle East or African states as well, that is an opportunity to engage with the North Korean people directly.
So there's always two sides of every coin. Let's go ahead and open it up to questions from the audience. If there is anyone in the room, we'll take a question first. I know we have some questions online as well. Our audience is shy right now, so we'll go to the online questions first. But if you do have a question, start thinking of it now. So let's start with, there's one question from Mark Tokola asking, is there some level of North Korean elite whose smartphones are able to communicate internationally?
I'm sure there is. I don't know where that line exists between you can communicate internationally and you can't. Some North Koreans do have the ability to communicate internationally. Trading companies, for example, will have the ability to access the internet. Some university students, researchers will have internet access. I suspect, though, even at the elite levels, everything under, number one, anything under Kim Jong-un will be surveilled. So even if you have the ability to do that, I think it will be very difficult to get away with very much. But where that level exactly is, I'm not sure. I don't know if you've got any thoughts.
Yeah, no, from the interviews that we've done, those who work in trading companies, and of course diplomats, when we look at the few North Koreans that did come to South Korea during that COVID-19 pandemic, there was a huge growth of diplomats defecting, and that was also, I think, very much connected to the access to information that they were getting compared to, there was a period in time when North Korea had closed its borders to its own people as well. And so those overseas, whether they were overseas workers, diplomats, students, had no idea when they would be able to go back to North Korea. And so I think the information that they were getting about COVID or the state of the world really affected the way in which they were able to make their decisions. But then going beyond that is, coming from South Korea, is that I think the way that the South Korean government is able to respond to elites coming, if they are to choose to defect, that is going to really start to affect the way that these people will make their decisions, and we see the differences in different administrations on how they treat elite North Korean defectors.
And maybe just sort of as a general background for any of our listeners who aren't familiar with North Korean cellular networks, if you could just explain the difference between the domestic and the international.
Yeah, so a regular North Korean cell phone user is able to access a domestic intranet. There is no internet access, it's just domestic websites and apps and services. And they're also able to call other domestic numbers, but they're not able to make or receive international calls. Foreigners who are in Pyongyang have access to a different system where they can get internet access, they can do all of the international stuff, but they can't access the domestic networks and they can't make calls to regular domestic numbers. And the idea is to try to prevent information flow from people that have international access to people that have domestic access.
Great. All right, we finally have some questions in the room. This hand was up first. Let's start back there. Please introduce yourself and ask your question.
Thank you all so much. I'm Ale. I'm with the Grand Strategy Program here. I was wondering about whether there's been some kind of like public opinion or informational effect from the casualties in Ukraine. I know there was very high casualty rates among North Korean soldiers in Ukraine. A lot of them weren't really prepared for that kind of context. Has that registered at home? Has there been some kind of outcry about it? Has that been suppressed? I was just wondering if there's been an effect there.
So we've been very closely following people's reactions to the Ukraine-Russia conflict. And certainly, very recently, Kim Jong-un held a memorial ceremony where the state officially acknowledged 102, I think, casualties. But I think people are aware that there likely have been significantly more, in part because of these rumors, and because these rumors predated official acknowledgement, there is a sense that the state is indeed hiding something. And one of the things about UMG is we can collect feedback from people who listen to our channels or consume our content, about 4 to 5 people per month. And so we've been following what they say about news coverage in particular about the Ukraine-Russia war. And there have been multiple people who said, after watching this video or after hearing this news about the Ukraine-Russia war and seeing the videos of the casualties, some of what we might see on our own TVs, for example, saying, I've made calls, I need to make sure that my son doesn't get sent to the military. So there are a lot of families that are trying to protect their own and act directly on that information.
A related question from one of our online viewers is this question about what are some of the themes and narratives that North Koreans are getting about Iran and Venezuela? And which of these narratives do you think as being the least credible or most internally contradictory to the average North Korean? Do you have any sense of how they're getting information about these, if they're getting information about these incidents, and how does it resonate with them?
Yeah. So actually, Daily NK, sorry to pub Daily NK constantly, but we do have an article that came out recently about study material. So North Koreans go to class consciousness meetings and things like that, these political education and indoctrination sessions. And one of the more recent study materials was about the kidnapping of President Maduro of Venezuela. And it was supposed to be about, look how evil the Americans are going and kidnapping another leader. But a lot of people at the session walked away going, the US military is so much more powerful than I thought. So it had a bit of an inverse reaction, but people said that couldn't happen in North Korea. The North Korean state tried to say, yes, it couldn't happen in North Korea because we have nuclear weapons, unlike Venezuela. And I think the Iran incident is going to show that perhaps nuclear weapons are more of a danger than a boon. I think it's going to be much harder for the state to play that same narrative that they did with Venezuela. So they've been kept largely quiet. They publicly, to the outside world, have condemned US action in Iran. But internally, we haven't seen a whole lot of discussion of it yet. But it is still developing. So check Daily NK or so.
You heard it here first. James? Please use the microphone.
Rose, if I could just push back on that just a little bit. I mean, the fact that they didn't have weapons yet, Iran, I think is going to, bolster their point that we are in a better place because we already have them. I have 2 questions, if I may. Martin, could you talk a little bit more about the Mokran productions I mean, for example, the Indian productions that are being permitted to be seen, are they editing out the dance scenes, for example, from Bollywood films? Are they producing in a way that is even censoring content? And how does this? Are they streamed over a channel? Is it something that people access through, one of these apps, for example? And then to Hannah's point that the goal is not to have everyone defect or escape, but to change from within. Rose, in the surveys that you're doing, are you getting a sense? Are you asking questions about the impact of greater awareness? I mean, so certainly the state must be cognizant of the fact that people have greater awareness of outside information and of human rights. Any indication that the regime is being responsive in some way to this through the survey results? Are people saying, well, yeah, we're hearing that people are who get detained are treated a little bit better now, or anything like that? Is the regime in any way being responsive? Are we seeing any of that change that we're hoping?
So on the first question about Mokran, through the app, I was able to access the catalogue of titles, but not actually watch any of the videos, which obviously require connection to the North Korean network, but also payment as well, because they're not free. The television, though, I mean, the Indian movie I watched, there was actually, I recorded everything, and I'm happy to show you later. There was one scene I had to rewatch because it was a sort of drama, and it was a guy getting mauled by a lion. I'm pretty sure it was all CG. But no, it was shown right there on Sunday morning, which was not what I was expecting to see on Sunday morning. The editing, though, is interesting because I think, yeah, definitely they're probably taking out things that they deem too much. But as Rose just said about the takeaway from the indoctrination sessions about what happened, sometimes people come away with different conclusions than the censors think. When I was watching Ratatouille, which I had not seen until I saw it on North Korean television, there's a scene where, right towards the end, where the food inspector opens the door to the kitchen, and there's about 1,000 rats in the kitchen. And the inspector has a look of horror on his face, and he turns around to run away when he sees all these rats. And the rats all run after him, and they capture him, and they tie him up. And I'm wondering if anyone watching that took away the conclusion that, well, if we all get together, we can defeat the powerful person. So I was surprised that was kept in there, but maybe when the censors watched it, they didn't even think of that. So it would be fascinating to do that in the future. Unfortunately, getting hold of the raw, the actual, DVDs or the streaming or the broadcast is very, very difficult to do. But yeah,
Could you see the price of the app?
I've got the prices of all the videos. I've got the prices of all the videos.
Like what's an average? Do you remember?
I think it depended on how old it was and whether it was part of a series or something. So it goes from like a few hundred, no, not hundreds of won. Yeah, a few hundred won up to a few tens of thousands. So it's not very expensive. But there is a price to it. Also, you have to pay to subscribe to the Rodong Shimbun daily newspaper as well. Which surprised me because I thought North Korea would want everyone to read the propaganda, but maybe it's a psychological thing in that you don't want to give it away for free because these are stories about the leader, so you have to pay for this stuff. I don't know, but
it's another form of tax collection.
Another form of tax collection, exactly.
Russ?
Yeah, just to add on to the censorship question, for example, we've seen in soccer games that are broadcast into North Korea, they will blur out the signs that are advertising for South Korean companies. They've been a little bit more lax with that lately. There was one very strange example of a BBC documentary, going back to what we said, the foreign content that is safe is nature documentaries, but they blurred out the host's blue jeans because those are American. So it is difficult to predict what the censors do see as risky or not. And then to go to your question about does the work that we do to bring information into North Korea, does it change anything within the country? And that is like the important question. And I think, to be practical about it, less so is it caused by awareness inside the country so much as pressure from outside of the country. I spoke to, this is not from our report, but I spoke to a escapee friend recently about her experiences. She was in China, and then she was caught and was going to be repatriated and was in a holding cell. And obviously these holding cells have very poor conditions. She's very scared of what's going to happen, but the people around her are very calm. And she asks, why is that? They go, this is my second time, and it's much better now. So there is some sort of impact that I think, especially in these visible areas, it's not necessarily because the security agents have learned the beauty of human rights so much as visible and public pressure.
Yeah.
But we do have seen, for example, the inclusion and the appearance of the word human rights, for example, has started to appear in North Korean law and in North Korean training materials. For example, there was a Daily NK report on instructions to the Ministry for State Security, so the equivalent of the police, talking about the human rights of people who are being arrested, and that they're supposed to know what they're for and that you're supposed to treat them with dignity. Obviously, this is not actually what's happening, but the fact that that exists means, at least formulaically, there is an awareness of these issues and they're trying to match it.
No, you go ahead.
Add to that for the forced repatriation report that we published, we also interviewed 100 North Korean escapees, especially if they'd been, horrible to think about, but repatriated more than once across different periods of time to be able to also compare the conditions. And for us, we don't always look at changes in North Korea pre-post Kim Jong-un, but pre-post COI as well, because I think that's really when we could see the effects. And I think through a mixture of what Rose was saying was international pressure, but through information going in about that, I know UMG broadcast, or VOA, RFA also a broadcast about what the international community are doing, different resolutions that are being passed, where not only did we hear about the detainees who had experienced the same detention facilities pre and post 2014 seeing changes, but those who used to work in the detention facilities, they were given instructions about not necessarily that they had the greater awareness of human rights, but that there was this human rights racket that the international community was pressuring them on. And I think for those of you who were around during COI times, where there would be some North Korean defectors that would show visible bruises or marks that they got through different horrific forms of torture, these were clear signs of evidence of the crimes against humanity that North Korea were committing, that these officials were then being trained on how can you get coerced confessions during these interrogations without laying your hands on these people. And so it's a different form of torture, lack of sleep, psychological torture, but they're very aware that this leads to the international community responding. And I think what we at NKDB have been seeing is that even in their reports to the international community, to the UN, through the Universal Periodic Review, through the CRPD, Convention on Persons with Rights of Disabilities, their first report was clear, propaganda. North Korea is a paradise on earth. But the recent reports that they published last year, 2024, there were clearly people within North Korea's Ministry of Foreign Affairs who are studying what human rights law and mechanisms mean, and are using accurate language, and also showing where North Korea's gaps are as well. Does that necessarily mean that there are changes on the ground? That's to be seen. But I wouldn't say that there's a lack of effect of the information going in and pressuring the leadership.
Hannah, let's stay with you. There's a question from online that mentions how your research talks about how North Korea is expanding coordination with its authoritarian partners. How does the population perceive this kind of cooperation? Is it seen as a sign of strength? Or does it undermine this, the regime's narrative of self-reliance of Juche? And could North Koreans who have worked or live abroad form a credible and influential target audience for messages of empowerment and resistance, or are they seen as tainted, or as valuable sources of knowledge by the domestic population? So several questions there.
Yeah. I mean, I think with this growing partnership with these authoritarian states, there is also a difference between, I think, how the North Korean people see it versus how the state sees this as a strategy moving forward. I think what's always interesting is that when we interview North Korean escapees, even recent ones, the few that have come, despite all the education that they receive about the US and this anti-imperialism, they were still much more excited about the prospect of a US DPRK summit, or in the previous information that the news that they had heard about Trump and Kim Jong-un meeting a few years ago, where I think there's still this strange nationalistic sentiment where they don't trust the Chinese, is something that we hear a lot from the North Korean people. And also this form of, I think, growing partnership doesn't necessarily flow down into benefiting the North Korean people in the way that they would like to see. Growing partnership with the Russians means that their brothers, sons, nephews, cousins are being dispatched to war. Which North Korean person would want to hear about that? This is only benefiting the North Korean state. So I'd be interested if UMG has done any public opinion surveys about this, but from the conversations that we've had with recent escapees, I would think that this isn't something that the North Korean people would necessarily welcome. And with the overseas workers, when we interviewed those who had been dispatched to Russia post-2019 for this report, there were a few that had been dispatched more than once. And they had said that going to Russia used to be something that people would really fight for. People were paying. And that's something that I think that's really important for people to understand, that we shouldn't just put this blanket statement that they're all slaves being forced to go overseas. It's very, very competitive. Well, it was very, very competitive. They do a thorough background check your songbun, check your background status. Most of them are from Pyongyang. You have to have family in North Korea so that there is less risk of you defecting. But some of the North Koreans that we interviewed had said that when they came back the first time, there was so much surveillance on them about the conversations that they might have with their family or their peers, what they were bringing back, that it became less of a competitive role or task that people would want to sign up for, because people would pay a lot of bribes to be sent overseas. It'd be interesting to see how much that has changed in recent years, but it seemed to be a bit more of a nuisance compared to the small amount of money that they'd be able to bring back.
So less about the public perception of them, but more so just the inconvenience of it when they got back.
Yeah.
Rose, did you want to add to that?
Yeah, certainly. So going to your first point about how people responded to the deepening alliance with Russia, I think in the beginning, especially when it was still a comprehensive strategic partnership, and it was rumors of North Korea sending missiles and munitions to Russia, there was a sense of pride among many of the North Koreans that we spoke with, saying that Russia needs us, Russia needs our military strength, that it makes North Korea look strong. And even during the first rumors of deployment, there were people going, yes, our soldiers are the ones who are going to help win this war. But it was, I think, after the casualties became clear that the reality of what that meant set in, and the tide of public opinion does appear to be changing, especially because in state media, for example, they talk about the grain that's being sent from Russia, right? For a lot of the payment from Russia is not in currency, it's in kind.
Right.
And so it should be things like Russian wheat and things like that. And the state has been pushing wheat-based recipes and wheat for, it has higher protein, so it's better for you. South Korea had something similar. But there's a lot of resistance to it because it is still very much a rice-based culture. But people are saying, so we've been told there's all this wheat that should be coming in, but we don't see it on the markets. So there is this sense that we're being told there should be some benefit, but they're not personally experiencing it.
All right, let's take a question in the room. Actually, let's go to the back.
Hi, thank you. Grant Turner with the Stimson Center. I was curious about two kind of unrelated things. You can pick either or. One is, as North Korea develops its kind of satellite programs, do you see that playing a greater role in their communications, like especially at the cell phone level, like infrastructure, and how long that might take to actually develop? And the other is, do you see them exporting any of their surveillance technology? Obviously, there's a lot of talk about China's exporting that sort of thing, but has North Korea had its own kind of market as well? Thank you.
Me maybe? I think they did say at one point that they wanted to launch a geostationary satellite, but I think that was only mentioned once and it hasn't been mentioned again. It's a lot more difficult to do communication satellites than the low Earth orbit stuff they've been trying. They might be targeting it, and they might, well, if they're targeting it, they will be successful eventually, but I think it's going to take a while for that to happen. In terms of the exporting, what's been interesting is actually how little North Korea has imported, because China's right in its doorstep and is the world leader in these types of systems. I think what North Korea lacks, though, at the moment is they lack the ability to kind of process all of this stuff. I mentioned this earlier. There's not a large data center in the country, and I don't think the North Koreans trust China enough for them to send a lot of this kind of very sensitive internal information over the border to be processed in a Chinese data center and to come back. So I think that's probably one of the biggest things holding up development at the moment. North Korea is very sort of poor in hardware development. It does buy a lot of hardware from overseas. All of the cell phones come from China. The CCTV cameras, the whole thing all comes from China, but the software, they all write themselves. So I think what you'll see is they'll continue to rely on other countries. They'll bring it all in. As for exporting, possibly, but I think the internal system is not as developed as the Chinese, who would be their competitors in the international market. So probably a lot of that stuff will just stay internal.
They're more so exporting the talent, not the products. So we have about 5 minutes left. I know there's 2 questions in the room. Why don't we take both of them? If you could keep them very short and directed, and we'll do a short round of answers to close this out. So we'll start here.
Thank you so much. I have a question about the expansion of digital surveillance, because that can also mean much more exposure to the international community, and it opens up more room for external actors to actually intervene in the situation. So I have a question of how did the international community react to the alliance of Russia, China, and DPRK in 2014, and how that changed over time right now, like in the introduction of AI and the development of digital surveillance, and how they intervene in the situation.
All right, and let's take Rachel up front also.
This is a question for Rose. To the extent that you feel comfortable sharing with us, do you have a sense, based on your interviews, testimonials from defectors maybe, how the North Korean public perceives a female leader?
Potentially.
Potentially.
All right, and then we'll do a quick round of answers.
I'm going to be slightly annoying. Sorry, I didn't fully understand what the question was. The first question?
Oh, the microphone,
Let's just
please.
wait for the mic.
So like the development of like digital surveillance and the exposure to the development of digital surveillance means much more exposure to the international community and the external actors, and that opens up more room for them to intervene in the situation. And I was like curious of how that changed over time and how they reacted, how they can react to the situation.
So I think there's an assumption here that there's cooperation on building digital surveillance? And if so, then does that create the opportunity for the potential partners to have also access to those surveillance? Is that right? Yeah.
Yeah, so everything we've seen on the digital surveillance, and there's only limited information about it, but the apps on the cell phones that will restrict what people can do and monitor what they can do were all developed internally at Kim Chaek University of Technology. The facial recognition systems that goes with the cameras all came from Kim Il-sung University. Most of or all of the software development we've seen is all internal. The only international cooperation going on is simply buying the hardware. So I think there's very little international collaboration going on any of that, at least as far as I've seen.
I mean, we have seen some of the journal articles of the engineers that are developing the technologies will reference outside materials, but the programming itself is done in country.
Yeah, and so there is reference to work done overseas, but that's just because whatever the video compression system used is just like used all over the world. So they'll reference some work done in how to. Just some of the work that's been done before, because that's kind of basically getting down to the sort of physics of how you do things, rather than they're working, say, with any particular company overseas and taking their software and modifying it, which at least in the stuff we see, we haven't seen any evidence of.
Yeah, and I would say, I mean, this event also started with the conversation that Martin was doing his research on digital surveillance in North Korea, NKDB was doing research on digital surveillance in China, and we wanted to see if there had been some overlap. And despite North Korea and China's deepening relationship, the surveillance and information that's being collected in China is not going over to the North Korea side, and what North Korea is collecting is not going to the China side, because each government has their own goal that they're trying to reach, and that's something that for them, this collection of information is being done for different objectives. And so I would also agree with Marta that it's being kept quite insular as a way of protecting their own state needs.
And then the question about perceptions of a potential female leader, and maybe just adding to that, if in any of your research through any of your networks, what do they think about the daughter?
Yeah, so it's one thing I want to first bring up is that within North Korea, most North Koreans do not know her name. I mean, we also technically don't know her name. It could be Juhae, it could be Juhae. There's different theories. She's always referred to as the beloved child or something, some similar epithet. And so oftentimes people who give us feedback, they say, this is the first time I heard her name. Mm. And there's, I think, a lot of interest in the outside world in Juhae, but among the North Korean public, I think she's not quite as attention-grabbing. Certainly, people are interested in seeing why she's out, and why that she's so prominently featured. But there's a lot less discussion about her as a potential heir to the throne, right? There's, I think, to put it bluntly, the patriarchy in North Korea is still so strong that even though Kim Jong-un has a lot more visible female politicians, Choi Sun-hee, for example, there's still people who are born into these Kim-related families who are brought in on the power of their families. And so it's very hard to envision that a female leader would be taken seriously. And I think the feedback that we get also very much operates on this premise, that it doesn't necessarily even occur to people that this is succession grooming. Yeah. It's much more likely him trying to be like, oh, he's a family man, or she's a stand-in for the future generations. Like these missiles are to protect the next generation, like her. People are much more interested in her height because she's very tall, and North Korean children tend to be very small because of malnutrition and things like that. How well she dresses, the fashion type, those things, those are much more talked about among North Koreans.
It's always good to have a reality check. Well, thank you so much to all of our panelists who are coming from Korea to join us today. Martin, for your continued research in the area of surveillance and technology. This has been a fabulous discussion, and if the audience can join me in thanking you. And certainly we always have more questions than time, but I appreciate everyone who attended in person and online, and we hope you will join us for future events. Thank you.